You can have the scraps. Her words were tossed out so casually, as though they carried no weight, yet they landed on me with the sharpness of broken glass. I sat at the end of the table, my fork balanced between my fingers, and I could feel the color rising in my cheeks before I even managed to form a response. My daughter-in-law, Claire, laughed as she scooped the last of the roasted potatoes onto my husband's plate, her manicured hand brushing against his as though it were an inside joke between the two of them. My husband chuckled in return, oblivious, or maybe willfully blind, and reached across for the gravy boat. I didn't say a word at first. I simply slid my plate forward, the edge of it scraping softly against the polished oak table, and in doing so, I signaled what I refused to voice. If scraps were what she thought I deserved, then so be it. I would not beg for more. My appetite had already withered anyway, replaced with a quiet ache that started in my chest and radiated outward. The room carried on as though nothing had happened. The grandchildren chattered between mouthfuls, their little voices rising like birdsong, punctuated by the clink of silverware and the scrape of serving spoons against ceramic bowls. My son, Matthew, sat at the head of the table, presiding over the meal in the same spot where, for 30 years, I had once carefully placed steaming dishes for him and his sister. He glanced at me briefly, his expression unreadable, before turning back to Claire and asking her about the neighbor's new car. I lowered my gaze to the plate before me. A thin slice of chicken breast, its edges dried and curling, sat beside a meager spoonful of peas. A few flecks of rosemary clung stubbornly to the meat, as though even they had been reluctant to stay. I pushed them gently with my fork, my mind elsewhere, though the words "you can have the scraps" echoed louder than the children's laughter. It is a strange thing, how humiliation doesn't always announce itself with fire or fury. Sometimes it seeps in slowly, like water under a closed door, filling every corner before you realize you're drenched. I kept smiling, nodding when one of the children asked if I had seen their drawing, murmuring polite responses to the chatter around me. But underneath that surface composure, a storm was gathering. I had once been the center of these Sunday lunches. It was my hands that seasoned the chicken, peeled the potatoes, whisked the gravy until it gleamed. My home had been filled with the aromas of garlic and thyme, the warmth of bread baking, the sound of chairs being pulled close as family gathered. I knew every preference, how Matthew liked extra carrots, how his sister avoided onions, how even as a boy he'd steal the crispiest potato from the tray before it reached the table. I had built a rhythm of care, a silent language of feeding those I loved. And yet here I was, at the far end, reduced to silence, being told that scraps were all that remained for me. I don't know if Claire meant it cruelly or thoughtlessly. Sometimes, I suspect that distinction doesn't matter as much as we want it to. A wound doesn't care whether the knife slipped by accident or was thrust deliberately. Either way, it bleeds. I chewed the dry chicken slowly, forcing it down with sips of lukewarm water. My eyes drifted to the window where sunlight streamed in, catching on the dust motes that swirled gently in the air. The garden outside was alive with the faint hum of bees and the sway of lavender stalks. It was a world that once belonged to me, where I had bent on my knees planting bulbs, where I had tied Matthew's shoelaces before he sprinted across the lawn. Now it felt like a view into another life, a memory framed by glass. The meal dragged on in cheerful tones that seemed at odds with the heaviness in my chest. Every so often, Claire's laughter cut through, sharp and confident, the kind of laugh that fills a room and leaves little air for others. Matthew leaned in toward her, smiling, as though the universe revolved around their shared orbit. Perhaps it did. But once, not long ago, it had revolved around me. When the plates were finally cleared, I rose quietly, gathering what few dishes were near me. Claire brushed past me, her perfume trailing behind, and said, "Oh, don't worry about that, I'll handle the dishwasher." But the words carried no gratitude, no recognition, just the efficiency of someone managing a household where I had become a guest. I set the plates down by the sink and stepped back, my hands folding into each other as though unsure of their purpose. I excused myself soon after, blaming fatigue, though none at the table seemed to notice. My husband stayed behind, immersed in a story Matthew was telling about work, nodding along with the same eager attention he once reserved for me. I retrieved my coat from the stand near the door, slipping it over my shoulders like a shield, and stepped outside. The air was brisk, sharper than it had seemed from inside. I walked slowly down the familiar path, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes, my breath leaving faint clouds in the cool afternoon. I thought about scraps, not just the literal ones on my plate, but the metaphorical kind I had been collecting for years without realizing it. Scraps of attention. Scraps of patience. Scraps of love. And for the first time, as I reached the gate and rested my hand on its iron latch, I wondered whether I had been complicit in my own diminishing. Perhaps by staying quiet, by sliding my plate forward without protest, I had agreed to this role. Perhaps silence, too, can be a kind of consent. But even as those thoughts swirled, another voice whispered beneath them, faint but insistent. A voice that asked, "What if you stopped accepting scraps?" I paused there for a long while, staring at the hedges lining the street, watching the leaves tremble in the breeze. I didn't have an answer yet. But for the first time in a long time, I knew the question itself mattered. I didn't speak of it that evening. When my husband and I returned home, he settled into his armchair with the newspaper, humming softly as though the day had been nothing more than pleasant chatter and full bellies. I hung my coat carefully on its hook, smoothing the sleeve out with deliberate attention. Some gestures, when the heart is heavy, become rituals of grounding. The clink of the hanger against the rod, the soft fall of fabric, the way my shoes rested side by the door, these were small assurances that some order remained in a world that felt increasingly disordered. I made us tea, though he didn't ask for it, though he barely lipped up when I placed the steaming cup by his elbow. He thanked me absently, his eyes still on the print before him, as though my presence had become a background habit, noticed, perhaps, but not regarded. I sat opposite him, cupping my own mug, letting the warmth seep into my palms. We didn't speak of the lunch. I don't know if he had noticed Claire's words, or if they had slid past him like water off stone. Some men have the gift of oblivion, and sometimes I wondered if it was gift or curse. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I replayed the afternoon. Not just the words, but the tone, the way Matthew hadn't flinched, hadn't stepped in, hadn't redirected the moment with a laugh or a light rebuke. That silence from him felt louder than his wife's remark. Silence can be a kind of agreement, and it stung worse than the laughter. In the days that followed, I found myself moving slower around the house. Not because I lacked strength, but because I was thinking more than doing. I stood longer at the kitchen window, watching the sparrows pick at crumbs, watching the neighbor's dog circle its patch of lawn. I folded laundry with an unusual care, smoothing every crease, stacking every shirt as though precision might soothe me. And yet, under each action, that phrase lurked, "You can have the scraps." It clung to me like a burr, catching on every thought, every quiet hour. One afternoon, I walked into town. The market square was alive with its usual hum, vendors calling out prices, baskets of fruit glowing in the weak autumn sun, the air tinged with roasted chestnuts and damp leaves. I wandered without hurry, pausing at stalls I didn't need to buy from, simply listening to the voices around me. A woman in a red scarf leaned across a crate of apples, laughing with the man selling them. An older couple debated the price of fish, their conversation a mixture of mild irritation and practiced familiarity. Life was going on, indifferent to my private turmoil. And oddly, that gave me a kind of comfort. I bought myself a scarf that day, deep green wool, softer than anything I usually allowed myself. It was not extravagant, but it was unnecessary, and perhaps that was the point. I had grown so accustomed to buying only what was practical, what served others, what fit into the framework of duty. This time, I chose something simply because I wanted it. As the vendor wrapped it in paper, I felt a small, almost imperceptible lift inside me. A seed of self-returning. When I returned home, my husband glanced at the package and asked, "What's that?" "A scarf," I replied. He nodded, uninterested, and returned to his crossword. But as I carried it upstairs and unwrapped it slowly, folding the wool against my neck, I caught my reflection in the mirror. There was something in my eyes I hadn't seen in a while, not joy, perhaps, but recognition. The next Sunday, I hesitated before lunch. My hands lingered on the coat stand, my heart thudding in a strange, quiet protest. Part of me wanted to stay home, to refuse the ritual entirely. But habit, or perhaps loyalty, propelled me forward. I went, as I always did, though something within me was shifting. Claire greeted us at the door with her bright smile, her lipstick freshly applied, her earrings catching the light. She kissed my husband on the cheek, then turned to me with a perfunctory, "Oh, you made it. Come in." Her tone was polite, but not warm. I stepped inside, noting how the house had been arranged to her taste: new curtains, a different rug, photographs of the children in sleek frames that bore none of the cluttered affection of my own displays. It was her home, undeniably, and I was a visitor. The meal unfolded much the same. Laughter, conversation that skimmed over the surface of things, children interrupting with small dramas. But this time, when the serving dishes circled, I helped myself early, taking a decent portion without waiting. Claire's eyes flicked toward me, surprised perhaps, but she said nothing. It was a tiny rebellion, but it steadied me. Still, the undercurrent remained. A comment here, a glance there, subtle exclusions, the kind that others might dismiss as oversensitivity. But I knew the weight of them, the accumulation of small slights that gradually carve out one's place at the margins. When dessert came, Claire served everyone slices of tart, and when she reached me last, she said with a smile that didn't touch her eyes, "Sorry, I think this is the smaller piece, hope that's all right." I ate it quietly, but I noted it. And as I did, I realized that I was no longer simply absorbing these moments. I was watching them, cataloging them. And in that noticing, a new awareness was taking root. Later that week, I found myself rummaging through an old box in the attic. Inside were photographs, me holding Matthew as a baby, me hosting Christmas dinners, me in the garden with flour on my apron and laughter on my lips. Evidence of a life where I was not an afterthought. I sat on the attic floor with those photographs spread around me, and I cried, not with the helplessness of scraps, but with the mourning of something precious that had been allowed to slip away. When the tears subsided, I felt lighter. Grief, when acknowledged, sometimes clears space for something else to grow. I gathered the photographs, placed them neatly back in the box, and carried one downstairs with me. A picture of me and Matthew when he was 7, his arms slung around my neck, his smile wide and unguarded. I placed it on the mantel, where my husband would see it, where I would see it every day. Not as a relic, but as a reminder. In the evenings, I began walking more. Past the park, down by the river, through streets I hadn't wandered in years. The rhythm of my steps steadied my thoughts. I noticed the play of light on water, the rustle of leaves, the way strangers' dogs trotted eagerly on leashes. Each walk reminded me that the world was larger than the confines of a dining room table where my worth was measured in leftovers. And slowly, without announcing it to anyone, I began to reclaim space. A scarf bought for myself. A photograph placed in plain view. A larger portion taken without apology. They were not grand gestures, but they were mine. Yet I also knew this was only the beginning. Because deep down, I sensed a choice forming, to continue living at the edges of my own life, or to step back into its center. And the more I thought of scraps, the more I realized I hungered for more than food at a Sunday table. I hungered for the dignity of being seen. The third Sunday after that remark, I woke earlier than usual. The house was still, my husband's breathing slow beside me. For a long time, I lay there listening, staring at the faint outline of the wardrobe in the dim light, feeling a restlessness I could no longer dismiss. Something in me had shifted, not enough to topple the structure of my life, but enough to unsettle it. I moved quietly to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and stood by the window as it began to boil. Outside, frost clung to the edges of the grass, turning each blade into a tiny shard of glass. The world was holding its breath, suspended in that delicate pause between night and morning. As I poured hot water over the tea leaves, I thought about the rhythm of these Sundays, the way they had once been a celebration and had now become a ritual of quiet diminishment. I had been taught, in the unspoken lessons of my generation, that a woman's role was to smooth, to soothe, to keep peace at any cost. But peace that demands silence is not peace. It is erasure. That realization had been circling me for weeks, growing louder with each polite slight at Claire's table, each silence from Matthew. When my husband stirred awake and wandered in, rubbing his eyes, I asked casually, "Do you ever feel unwelcome at their house?" He blinked at me, surprised by the question. Unwelcome? No. They're family. Why do you ask? I shrugged, stirring sugar into my tea. Just wondering. He studied me for a moment, but when I didn't elaborate, he let it go. That was his way, not to prod at shadows. But I couldn't ignore them anymore. At lunch that day, Claire was in high spirits. She talked about redecorating the guest bedroom, about the school fundraiser, about Matthew's latest project at work. I listened, nodding where expected, smiling faintly when the children interrupted with their antics. But when the serving dishes made their rounds, I noticed again how she paused ever so slightly before offering me the smallest portion, as though it were second nature. And this time, instead of silently accepting, I reached forward, served myself fully, and set the spoon back without looking at her. It was a simple act, barely noticeable to anyone else. But I caught the flicker in her eyes, the faint tightening of her mouth. A crack in the performance. And in that moment, I felt something steady inside me, not triumph, but a quiet refusal to keep shrinking. After lunch, I offered to take the children to the park. Claire hesitated, then agreed, perhaps relieved to have an hour free. I walked with them down the familiar path, their small hands tugging at mine, their laughter spilling into the air. At the swings, I pushed them higher, listening to their squeals, and I realized something I had forgotten: they saw me without judgment. To them, I wasn't a woman at the end of the table. I was their grandmother, the one who studied the swing, who tied their shoelaces, who listened to their endless stories. In their eyes, I was still whole. When we returned, Claire thanked me, her smile polite but tight. I returned it with one of my own, just as polite, but inside, I carried the laughter of the swings like a shield. That night, back at home, I pulled out an old notebook. Its pages were yellowing, the cover worn, but it still carried the faint smell of paper and ink. I began to write, not polished entries, not tidy reflections, just fragments. What Claire said. What Matthew didn't. How it felt to buy that green scarf. How the children laughed at the swings. Each word was like placing a stone on a path I hadn't walked in years. I had forgotten the release of writing, the way it gathers scattered thoughts and lays them in order. Days passed, and the notebook filled slowly. With each page, I noticed myself standing taller, speaking a little clearer, making choices without waiting for permission. One morning, I went to the cafe in town, alone, something I hadn't done in years. I ordered coffee and a slice of cake, sat by the window, and watched people passing. No one needed me in that moment. No one measured my worth by what portion I served or didn't. I was simply there, alive in my own company. And it felt good. Still, the ache of Matthew's silence lingered. His complicity weighed heavier than Claire's sharpness. A mother expects her children, above all, to see her. To defend her when others diminish her. And yet he had let those words pass. He had let them stand. That betrayal, not loud, not violent, but quiet, cut deepest. One evening, I asked him about it. We were alone, Claire busy with the children. I leaned across the kitchen counter, my voice calm but steady. Matthew, I said, do you remember what Claire said to me 2 weeks ago? About scraps? He looked uncomfortable, shifting on his feet. Oh, Mum, she was joking. You know how she is. It didn't feel like a joke. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. You're reading too much into it. She didn't mean anything by it. I stared at him, the boy I had once carried on my hip, the man who now looked through me. Maybe not. But you could have said something. You could have shown me you were listening. He looked down, muttered, I didn't think it mattered. That was the wound, laid bare, I didn't think it mattered. I walked home heavier that evening, the night air cold against my face. But as I turned the key in my own door, I knew something had shifted again. His silence had once left me doubting myself. Now, it clarified things. I could not wait for him to defend me. I could not wait for Claire to change. If I was to reclaim myself, it would not be by their permission. It would be by my own. So I began small. I joined a book club at the library, something I had always put off. I bought myself flowers from the market, arranging them on the kitchen table without apology. I started cooking meals the way I liked them, not just what I thought my husband preferred. Each act felt like stitching together pieces of a fabric I had once let unravel. Claire noticed, of course. One Sunday, she had the new brooch on my coat and said lightly, "Someone's been shopping." I smiled and replied, "Yes, I have." Just that. No explanation, no deflection. The children tugged at my sleeve then, asking me to play a game, and I followed them into the living room, leaving Claire standing by the door. I could sense her confusion, perhaps even irritation, but I no longer felt bound to soften it. My life had been built around smoothing edges, and now I was learning the strength of leaving them as they were. And as I wrote each evening in my notebook, I began to see a pattern. I was not simply reacting anymore. I was choosing. Choosing how to spend my time, what to wear, where to walk, whom to listen to. Choosing myself, in ways large and small. It didn't erase the sting of Claire's words, nor the wound of Matthew's silence. Those scars would remain. But they no longer defined me. They were part of my story, not the whole of it. And that, I realized, was the beginning of freedom. The fourth Sunday arrived with an unease that pressed against my ribs from the moment I woke. I dressed carefully, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I wanted to honor myself. I pinned the brooch to my coat, a modest silver piece shaped like a leaf, and wrapped the green scarf around my neck. Standing before the mirror, I didn't see a woman shrinking. I saw someone studying. Someone remembering. When we arrived, Claire opened the door as always, her smile polite and practiced. Her eyes darted briefly to the scarf, then the brooch, and though her lips didn't falter, I noticed the flicker. It was small, but I caught it. Once, such a look would have made me falter, second-guess my choices. This time, I adjusted the scarf slightly, as if to say yes, I know you see it, and I will not hide it. The table was already set, the chicken glistening, the vegetables arranged neatly. Claire took her place at Matthew's side, directing the meal with an ease that was both confident and territorial. My husband, ever agreeable, slipped into his chair with a sigh of contentment. I sat at the far end once again, but this time, I placed my hands on the table with deliberate calm, feeling the wood grain beneath my palms. When the serving dishes began their journey, I didn't wait. I reached first, helping myself to what I wanted. The clatter of spoons filled the silence, but I sensed Claire's watchful eye. She laughed at something Matthew said, her hand brushing his arm, but I knew she had noticed. It was the children, as always, who softened the edges. They ran between courses, tugging at my sleeve to show me their drawings, climbing into my lap for stories. Their weight against me, their trust, was a balm. In their laughter, I heard echoes of Matthew's childhood, of afternoons when he would lean against me, sticky with jam, asking endless questions about the world. That memory tugged at something deep, love tangled with disappointment, tenderness tangled with hurt. Halfway through the meal, the conversation turned to holiday plans. Claire spoke of a trip to the coast, describing the cottage they had booked, the views of the sea. "It will be good for the children," she said, her eyes bright. "They need a change of scenery." I nodded, waiting. Some part of me, foolishly hopeful, expected an invitation. After all, I had been there for every milestone, every scraped knee, every birthday cake. Surely, there would be space for me. But Claire simply turned to my husband and asked if he might be willing to water the plants while they were away. He agreed readily, as though it were the most natural arrangement in the world. And just like that, I was written out of the story. I felt the air leave me in a slow, invisible exhale. I lifted my glass of water, took a sip, and let the coolness anchor me. No one noticed the silence that followed. Or perhaps they chose not to. Later, when we returned home, I hung my coat carefully as always. But inside me, something snapped quiet and clean, like a thread pulled too tight. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even grief. It was clarity. I could no longer pretend that scraps of food, of attention, of belonging were enough. That week, I began making small plans of my own. I visited the travel agency in town, a modest shop tucked between a bakery and a florist. The clerk, a kind woman with laugh lines around her eyes, showed me brochures of places I had never considered. I didn't choose anything extravagant. Just a quiet bed and breakfast by the coast, not far from where Matthew and Claire were headed, though I didn't tell them. I booked a week in June, paid the deposit, and left the shop with the receipt folded carefully in my handbag. The act of booking it was more than a holiday. It was a declaration to myself: I could still choose. I could still step into the world, not as someone's mother or grandmother or silent guest, but as myself. I didn't tell my husband at first. He was comfortable in the patterns of our life, content with the Sunday rituals and the crossword puzzles. I didn't want his hesitance to dull my resolve. Instead, I prepared quietly, gathering a few clothes, setting aside a novel I had been meaning to read. The anticipation itself became a light in the week. At the next Sunday lunch, I carried myself differently. Claire spoke of their trip again, listing the activities she had planned for the children, her voice brimming with satisfaction. I smiled politely, listening, but inside I held my own secret, a trip of my own, not theirs to dictate. The knowledge warmed me more than the food on my plate. After dessert, when the children begged me for another story, I gathered them in the living room and told them about the sea. Not their mother's version, but mine, the smell of salt in the air, the way waves crash and retreat, the shells hidden in the sand. Their eyes widened, and they peppered me with questions. I answered each one, my voice steady, my imagination alive. For a moment, I wasn't at the edge of their lives. I was at the center of their wonder. That evening, back at home, I finally told my husband about the trip. He looked surprised, lowering his glasses. "Alone?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "I want to." He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "If that's what you'd like." "It is," I said simply. And for once, there was no doubt in my voice. The weeks leading up to June passed with a quiet anticipation. I continued writing in my notebook, filling its pages with plans, reflections, fragments of memory. The act of writing had become not just a record, but a mirror, showing me who I was becoming. And as the day approached, I found myself walking taller, speaking clearer, carrying that green scarf with a sense of quiet pride. The scraps that had once weighed me down no longer defined me. For the first time in years, I was beginning to taste wholeness. June arrived with the gentlest of breezes, the kind that carries the scent of cut grass and open skies. On the morning I packed my small suitcase, I felt a nervous energy I hadn't known in years. It wasn't the kind of flutter I felt when preparing family holidays, when every list was double-checked and every bag packed with snacks for children and raincoats for sudden storms. This was different. This was mine alone. I folded my clothes carefully, tucked in the book I had saved for quiet evenings, and slid the green scarf on top as if sealing the promise I had made to myself. When I lifted the case, light but sufficient, I felt the weight of something more than fabric and paper. I was carrying a new version of myself, one I wasn't ready to announce but was determined to protect. My husband saw me off at the door, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and support. "Call me when you arrive," he said, his hand resting briefly on my shoulder. I nodded, kissed his cheek, and walked down the path with my suitcase rolling behind me. For once, I didn't look back. The train ride was long but steady, the countryside unfolding in a blur of fields and hedgerows. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass and let the rhythm of the wheels soothe me. Every mile carried me further from the weight of Sunday lunches, further from Claire's remarks, further from Matthew's silence. And with each mile, I felt a loosening inside me, as though invisible cords were untangling. When I arrived at the small coastal town, the air greeted me with salt and gull cries. The bed and breakfast was modest, painted in cheerful blues, with flower boxes spilling over the windowsills. The woman who welcomed me had kind eyes and a laugh that filled the narrow hallway. She showed me to my room, a simple space with a view of the sea, the horizon stretching wide and endless. That first evening, I walked along the shore. The tide was low, revealing rocks slick with seaweed, pools of water holding tiny crabs and darting fish. Children shrieked with joy as they chased the waves, and dogs bounded after sticks. I stood with my shoes in hand, the water lapping cool around my ankles, and I breathed deeply. It was not escape I felt, but return to something I had forgotten, the vastness of the world, the smallness of insults once magnified by closeness. Each day followed a rhythm of simplicity. Breakfast at the small table by the window, walks along the cliffs where the wind whipped my hair, afternoons spent reading in the quiet garden. I wrote in my notebook each evening, the words spilling easier now. I wasn't writing about scraps anymore. I was writing about gulls, and waves, and the taste of fresh fish at the harbor cafe. I was writing about the way my heart quickened at the sight of the horizon, how it reminded me that life is not confined to one table, one household, one set of judgments. On the third day, as I sat on a bench watching the tide roll in, I saw a family pass by. A mother, a father, 2 children with buckets and spades. They were laughing, calling out to one another. For a moment, my chest tightened. The resemblance was too near, too close to what Matthew's family might look like on their holiday. I thought of them, perhaps not far from here, living out their version of seaside joy. And I wondered, had they thought of me at all? The ache was sharp, but it didn't undo me. Instead, I let it pass through me, like a wave. Because even in that ache, I felt the strength of being here on my own terms. Their exclusion had once felt like the end of my story. Now it was only a chapter. By the end of the week, I felt taller, steadier. I had laughed with strangers, shared meals with other travelers, walked paths without waiting for anyone's lead. On my last night, I stood at the water's edge and whispered to the sea, "I am still here." The words were carried away by the wind, but they remained in me like an anchor. When I returned home, suitcase rolling behind me once more, I carried a new quietness, not resignation, but resolve. My husband asked about the trip, and I told him it was beautiful, restful, needed. He nodded, and though he didn't ask for details, I offered them anyway. I described the cliffs, the taste of salt on the air, the laughter of children by the tide. As I spoke, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not envy, but recognition. Perhaps he, too, understood that I had found something he could not give me. The next Sunday, when we arrived at Matthew's house, I carried that steadiness with me. Claire opened the door, surprised perhaps by the brightness in my step, though she masked it quickly. At the table, the meal unfolded as it always did, but I was different now. When she served me last, I didn't flinch. I ate what I had and smiled at the children, my heart still filled with the sea. After dessert, Matthew asked politely, "How was your week?" "We heard you went away." I looked at him steadily. "It was wonderful. I went to the coast." His eyebrows lifted slightly, as though he hadn't expected it. "Alone?" "Yes," I said. "And it was exactly what I needed." He nodded, unsure what to say, but the silence that followed no longer crushed me. It was mine to fill or not, and I chose not. The children tugged at me then, asking for a story, and I followed them gladly, leaving Matthew and Claire at the table. Their world no longer held me captive. That evening, back at home, I wrote in my notebook, "I do not live on scraps anymore. I live on my own terms." It wasn't anger that filled me now, but peace. Not a perfect peace, there would still be slights, still be disappointments, still be the ache of Matthew's silence. But I was no longer defined by them. I thought of the sea again, the way waves retreat only to return, endless, unbroken. And I knew, I, too, would return to myself, again and again, no matter how many times I was pushed to the edges. The week after my return, life resumed its familiar rhythm, but something in me had changed so deeply that even the smallest actions felt different. When I boiled the kettle in the morning, I no longer did it absent-mindedly. I listened to the bubbling rise as though it were a companion. When I walked through town, I carried myself straighter, not out of pride, but out of presence. And when I sat at my writing desk in the evenings, I no longer wrote only of hurt. I wrote of possibility. Still, Sundays loomed. The gatherings had become the stage for my quiet undoing, and though I had returned from the sea stronger, I knew the test would come at that same table where Claire's voice carried and Matthew's silence pressed hardest. That Sunday, I dressed in my green scarf once more, not as armor but as remembrance. My husband glanced at me as we left the house, his eyes softer than usual. He hadn't said much about my trip since I'd come back, but I caught him watching me at odd moments, as though measuring the difference. Perhaps he sensed it, the subtle shift of someone who had found a steadier footing. When Claire opened the door, her smile was the same, her lipstick fresh, her tone brisk. "Come in," she said, and we did. But the air felt different to me. Not heavier, not lighter, simply less binding. At the table, the ritual unfolded as always. Chicken, potatoes, vegetables, the scrape of serving spoons, the chatter of children. But when the dish reached me last, I served myself without hesitation. Claire's eyes lingered for a beat, then moved on. Matthew said nothing, as ever. Yet for the first time, their silence did not wound. It revealed. It told me plainly where I stood in their world, not at the center, not in the warmth. And instead of fighting that, I accepted it. Acceptance was not surrender. It was clarity. After dessert, when the children begged me for another story, I led them into the living room. Their small bodies leaned against me, their questions tumbled out, and I gave them the sea again, the tide, the shells, the endless horizon. They listened wide-eyed, their imaginations lifting them far beyond the walls of the house. And in their rapt faces, I saw something profound, legacy. Not through my son, not through Claire, but through these children who knew me as more than scraps. To them, I was a teller of wonders, a safe lap, a steady hand. Later, as my husband and I walked home, he said quietly, "You seemed different today. Lighter." I smiled. "Perhaps I am." He nodded, and we walked in silence, the evening air cool around us. In the weeks that followed, I built more of a life outside that Sunday table. I went to the library's book club each Tuesday, where we argued gently over novels and drank lukewarm coffee in paper cups. I started volunteering at the community center, reading to children who didn't have grandparents nearby. Their eager faces mirrored my grandchildren's, and in their laughter I felt both healing and purpose. I also allowed myself small indulgences. Flowers from the market. A new pair of shoes, comfortable but elegant. A bright notebook with a sturdy spine. None of these things were extravagant, but each carried a message. I was worth choosing. And gradually, I realized I no longer dreaded Sundays. They were what they were, noisy, polite, sometimes cutting, sometimes tender. But they were no longer the measure of my life. They were one meal in a week filled with many others. One particular Sunday, months later, Claire made a remark, something light, something meant to amuse at my expense. I don't even remember the exact words now. But I do remember what I did. I looked at her, held her gaze, and smiled. Not a smile of agreement, not one of wounded silence. A smile that said, "I see you. But I also see myself. And I am no longer small." She faltered, just slightly. The conversation moved on. And inside, I felt a peace so quiet and complete that I almost laughed. Matthew remained who he was, kind at times, distracted at others, silent more often than not. I no longer expected him to intervene, no longer measured his love by the moments he failed to defend me. That shift was not easy, it took months of writing, walking, remembering. But eventually, I understood, my worth was not in his words, nor in hers. It was in mine. The notebook that began with scraps now brimmed with seas and gardens and laughter. Pages filled with small victories, quiet revelations, everyday beauty. It had become a record not of exclusion, but of reclamation. Sometimes, late at night, I would turn to my husband and speak of the future. Not in grand plans, but in little hopes. A train ride to another town. A class at the art center. Perhaps even another trip to the sea. He would nod, sometimes hesitant, sometimes curious. And though he did not always join me, I went anyway. That was the difference. I went anyway. The final piece of transformation came not in defiance, but in stillness. One Sunday, as we sat after lunch, the children playing in the garden, Claire bustling in the kitchen, Matthew talking with my husband, I sat quietly in my chair and looked around the room. I felt no urge to fight for space, no ache for recognition. I simply sat, whole within myself, and thought, this is not all of me. This is only one room in a vast house. And I know the other rooms now. When we left, I paused at the door, tying my scarf tighter against the wind. Claire called after us, "See you next week." Her voice was cheerful, brisk. I turned, smiled politely, and said, "Yes, perhaps." And I meant it. Not as promise, but as choice. Walking home, I thought again of that first day, the words that had cut me open, "You can have the scraps." They had once echoed in me like a verdict. Now, they sounded like a beginning. Because in being handed scraps, I had learned to hunger for more. And in that hunger, I had found myself. I opened the door to my own home, set the kettle to boil, and pulled out my notebook. I wrote one final line for the day. I do not wait for scraps. I lay my own table.